Rejected by every college, now she's Harvard's youngest black professor. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Eliza May Brooks woke up a few minutes before her alarm. The room was still dark, even though the sun had technically risen. The windows in their part of town hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years. Outside, grime dimmed the daylight. Her walls weren't decorated with posters of pop stars or snapshots with friends. Instead, quotes taped up with fading Scotch tape, handwritten lines from sociology textbooks, essays by Toni Morrison, and passages from Howard Zinn. The local library's copier had been out of order forever, and books weren't exactly flying off the shelves into students' hands, so Eliza copied everything down by hand. This room was her refuge, her lab, her war zone. Her desk, an old door laid across bricks. On top, a vintage typewriter from her grandfather and a neat stack of rejection letters. White, uniform, impersonal. She tore open another one. Dear Miss Brooks, thank you for your interest in our institution. That's all she needed to read. The rest was just noise. Hope had long since left the building. All that was left was grit. This was rejection number 13. Eliza was 16, but didn't look it. Her face was sharp, her eyes already tired. She wore her braids pulled back tight, like discipline started at the scalp. Her sweater was gray with a mended elbow. The pants, hand-me-downs from her mother, refashioned into something almost new. Fashion wasn't on her radar. Pretty or not pretty, irrelevant. Those were luxuries for other girls. Her mom, Mrs. Brooks, got home just after sunrise, peeling off her uniform slowly. It smelled like sweat and antiseptic. She worked cleaning offices, schools, hospitals, wherever needed. 10, 12 hours a shift, sometimes 2 in a row. Mom, Eliza said softly, you didn't eat again. How many came today? Her mom asked without looking up, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. 3, all numbers. But I'm still waiting on Chicago. And there's this college in Indiana. They've got a humanities program. Mrs. Brooks didn't respond. It wasn't that she didn't believe in Eliza's dream. She was just afraid, like all mothers are, that reality would crush her daughter too early. At school, Eliza was met with side eyes and whispers. Not envy, doubt. Too smart, too serious, too not from here. Teachers looked right through her. Classmates muttered, she thinks she's special. Harvard? Please. She'll be working checkout at Crofter's by summer. In literature class, Eliza asked questions no one expected. About class structures in novels, about race and power dynamics. Mr. Howley, the only white teacher in the building, often kept her after class. You understand narrative structure better than some of my college kids, he once told her. But fair warning, that won't always help. Some people don't want you knowing too much. She nodded. She knew, but she kept going anyway. Every day brought more letters. 2, sometimes 3. Always the same. Formal, emotionless, polite rejections. No one said she wasn't good enough. Just not quite the fit. Born in the wrong zip code, went to the wrong school, no glowing recommendations from PhDs, no academic medals, no fancy competitions. At night, after school, after cleaning their apartment, Eliza sat at the typewriter. 1 essay per application, everyone tailored, everyone original. The role of self-discipline in post-industrial America. Why access to knowledge is a justice issue. Literature as an act of resistance. Her writing wasn't lyrical, but it was sharp, structured, backed by facts. She wrote like someone who had something to say and no one to hear it. One night when her mom had to pick up an extra shift, Eliza came along. It was a late-night diner downtown. Eliza scrubbed floors, wiped tables while drunk office workers gnawed on leftover wings. One man saw her pulling a book out of her backpack and smirked. Well, what do we have here? Black feminists of the 20th century? Cute. Gonna teach us a lecture someday? In the meantime, there's trash under that table. Eliza pressed her lips together, looked him straight in the eye. I'm reading, she said, so I don't end up under that table. He snorted and turned away. Every day looked like the one before, but every night Eliza cracked open another book. Most of them came from Caitlin, a white college volunteer who dropped off boxes of used paperbacks every week. Caitlin didn't act like a savior. No speeches, no sympathy, just a quiet smile. You're the only one who returns them in better shape than she got them, she once said. Eliza's room started turning into a mini library. Dog-eared books on Southern history, autobiographies of activists, old linguistics manuals, anything she could find. She read, took notes, cut out quotes, built diagrams. Nobody taught her academic writing. She figured it out by failing, erased whole pages, started over, sometimes cried quietly so her mom wouldn't hear. 3 months passed. 35 rejections, 2 non-responses, 1 maybe. Your application is on file, but we are unable to offer admission this year. That sounded close to hope, but it wasn't a yes. School would be over in 2 weeks. Meryl Danes, one of the perfect girls, announced at lunch that she got into Brown. Her letters were the real kind, glowing. Her dad was a lawyer. Her mom taught at Georgia Tech. And you, Brooks, Meryl said, all sugar and smirk. Harvard, right? Not sure they're really looking for people like us. Eliza didn't answer. She went home and peeled a quote off her ceiling. The ones who don't fit often build their own place, but first they'll be pushed away 100 times. That night she didn't write, just sat by the window listening to her mom in the next room count dollar bills, tip money, save for bills. Outside someone shouted. A police siren flashed by. Atlanta was awake, but it wasn't dreaming. Eliza pulled out a fresh sheet, sat at the typewriter. Another essay, another chance. One more try. She didn't know where she'd get in, but she knew one thing for sure. If she quit now, she'd be the one closing the door on herself. After the last rejection, University of Illinois, plain white envelope, Eliza stopped asking the mailman, anything from Harvard today? She stopped flinching when she opened the mailbox. She still opened the letters, still filed them away, but they didn't cut anymore. They just hummed in the background like highway noise. The hurt was gone. All that was left was exhaustion. And still, every night she sat back down, as if each new page was a dare to believe in herself, even when no one else would. To stay close to the world she was fighting to be part of, Eliza signed up for a volunteer program at the local library. It was free, didn't need references. She worked in the district archive, a basement beneath an old bank, chipped paint, flickering lights. One side a garage, the other a pawn shop. Inside it was cold even in July, and everything smelled like damp pages and dust. Most volunteers didn't stay long, but for Eliza, it was a way to keep her hands on history. At first, they gave her the most boring job, sorting yellowed newspapers from the 1950s, tagging duplicate articles, neatly boxing them up. But Eliza quickly realized this wasn't just dust and ink. This was evidence, missed names, overlooked stories, forgotten Black activists who never made it into the school textbooks. She started taking notes, first by hand, then typing them up at home on her grandfather's typewriter. Folders began to pile up on her desk with labels like Invisible Scientists, Black Women in Medicine Before 1930, Education in Segregated Schools, No Pay, No Thanks, No Audience. But Eliza felt it deep in her bones. These weren't just scraps of history. This was resistance. If no college would take her in, she'd build a university of her own. No campus, no professors. Just her and the truth. Along the way, she began writing articles. Not for journals that wanted peer reviews or websites that charged a fee to publish. She wrote simply, but with precision. Every fact double-checked. Every quote cited. Her first piece was called The First Teachers at Black Schools in Atlanta, Names We Forgot. She mailed it to the reader submission section of a small local history magazine, expecting nothing. A month later, she got a letter. They'd publish it in the next issue. No payment, no cover story, but her name would be there. It wasn't a win, just a breath of air before the next stretch underwater. Every morning was the same. Wake up at 5, check the mail, pack leftovers for lunch, help her mother prep dinner for her night shift. 10 a.m., archive, 2 p.m., school. After that, back to the library or home to sort through fresh clippings. Her days ran on a tight schedule, like a doctor's office. Except nobody was waiting for her. She showed up anyway. Her mother would glance at the piles of paper with quiet unease. Not because she was angry, just afraid. She couldn't understand why her daughter worked so hard for something that didn't pay a single bill. But she didn't interfere. One night she said, "If you're doing all this for free, maybe it means you still believe it matters." Eliza didn't answer. She did believe. She just didn't know. To whom? At the archive, people started to recognize her. One librarian, Miss Andrews, mid-60s, tight gray curls, eyes that saw everything, stopped her one day and said, "I've seen the way you file your research. You're not just flipping pages. You're looking. And folks who look usually find more than they bargain for." Eliza nodded. They never spoke about it again. School didn't change. Her classmates still ignored her. Merrill Danes, now a minor local celebrity, smiled from the school bulletin board in a photo next to her headline, "From Our Halls to Brown University." Teachers lowered their voices when speaking to her, like they were already talking to someone important. No one asked about Eliza anymore. Even Mr. Hawley, once her quiet supporter, now kept his distance, like her string of rejections had embarrassed him. She didn't get bitter. She just returned to the archive. That's where she first stumbled across a name that made her stop. Dr. Mabel Curtis, a black woman who, in 1893, started a secret literacy school for girls in Savannah. Not a word about her in any official history books. Just one tiny note in an old newspaper. Illegal classroom discovered, believed to involve a colored woman. Eliza printed every record she could find. Took a week to write the article, 2 more to edit it. She signed it E.M. Brooks. This time, she sent it to a small, independent academic journal. No reply. A month passed. She almost forgot about it. Then in mid-October, a heavy envelope arrived, off-size, no return address. Inside, a copy of the journal, her article, the last page, no edits, her byline, no celebration, but published. She held it for a long time. It wasn't about her name in print. It was about Mabel Curtis. Someone would read about her now. Someone would know this didn't all start with modern laws and polished school halls. History wasn't just what got taught. It was also what got hidden. The article didn't change Eliza's life. Nobody at school knew. Her mother couldn't tell this one apart from the others. But something inside her settled. Even if no college ever accepted her, she was already a scholar, no degree, just the work. In early November, as the Atlanta air turned crisp, Caitlin showed up again with another box of books. She walked into the library like always, set the box down, and turned to leave. Eliza caught up with her, held out the journal. I wrote this. Thanks for giving me books to read." Caitlin flipped through the first page, looked up and said, "You write like someone who actually has something to say. I hope they figure that out one day." She didn't say who they were. And just like that, the school year marched on. Fewer letters arrived, fewer rejections too. Not because the world changed. Eliza just stopped applying. She was writing articles now, compiling data on illiteracy rates among black women in 1910, comparing educational access across southern states. These weren't class projects. These were future research drafts, if there ever came a future for them. If not, she'd keep writing anyway. She pinned a new quote to her bedroom wall, carefully cut from a magazine. Self-education isn't a substitute for the system. It's a refusal of it. Spring came early in Atlanta, but warmth in the Brooks household came more from habit than sunshine. The coal stove, worn rugs, the smell of old paper and fatigue. Eliza always woke before the alarm, if they'd had one. By 6 a.m., Mrs. Brooks was already in the kitchen, rustling through sandwich bags, getting ready for another shift at the private clinic. Their morning talks were short, not out of silence, but because there was nothing left to give. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" her mother asked, eyes flicking to the messy stack of pages on the desk. Eliza just nodded and slipped an apple into her bag. Her gaze held no exhaustion, only focus, the kind you sharpen into armor. It was Saturday, no school, church, and tutoring day. While other kids her age played ball, messed around, or slept in, Eliza headed to the place where she still felt needed. Every Saturday in the basement of a battered Baptist church, volunteers ran reading sessions for younger kids, mostly from Eliza's own neighborhood. Locals called it the concrete of hope: cracked gray walls, rusted handrails, a heavy door with peeling paint. Inside, the smell of coffee, paper, and time. This was the church where Eliza herself had learned to read once: Bible verses and the Atlanta Voice. Now she stood on the other side, helping others find their first words. In a room divided by mismatched furniture into makeshift zones, Eliza sat on the floor, cradling an old, worn picture book open in her lap. 7 kids lounged around her, bored, restless, but still listening. One boy, Jalen, kept interrupting, rattling his pencils. Eliza's voice never wavered. And that's why words matter, because if you can't say what you want, you'll never get it. This wasn't just story time. It was her belief passed on to kids only a few years younger, already hearing the same lines she once did. "You're too slow. College isn't for people like you. That book isn't for you." When class ended, she packed the books into an old duffel bag. Those quiet, weary moments without an audience gave her something else: proof that her voice had been heard somewhere. And if not by a university, then here in this little church basement in Atlanta, every session was an act of resistance. Back in her own tiny room, a bed, a desk, paper boxes, and new, rescued books. She'd collected them from library sales, volunteers, the neighborhood. Some were missing covers, others had handwritten notes on the end papers. Eliza sorted them by hand, creating her own classification: Southern history, labor relations, 19th century black press, early pedagogy. Her library lived on a second homemade shelf: scrap lumber, nails, a coat of paint borrowed from a neighbor. Everything was neat, her notes colored but restrained. She wasn't just reading, she was analyzing, like an archivist: footnotes, quotes, comparisons. She was building a research project with no advisor, no academic access, but with rigor and structure that would earn respect in any university setting. Her topic was precise: literacy as a driver of economic inequality during Southern industrialization. This wasn't just history, it was personal, about her family, her neighborhood, about the people who couldn't read and now scrubbed floors in hospitals, like her mother. The article was clear, unemotional, full of numbers and archived examples, just what she'd learned from Caitlin's donated collections. Once, Caitlin noticed Eliza's dark circles under her eyes and said softly, "You're not resting again." Eliza replied, "I rest when I see progress." And that was the truth. Then Eliza found a tiny grant opportunity: the Ruth Jordan Foundation. Just a few lines in a library flyer: supporting young researchers from marginalized communities. No pomp, just a no-frills application. She sent in her article, a short letter, a copied school transcript, and a brief bio. Then, she forgot about it. She knew these applications disappeared into a void. A month later, after 5 straight days of rain, her mom came home from the night shift and found a blue envelope in the mailbox. Eliza braced herself for another rejection, but the handwriting was neat. She opened it, her hand trembling. It read, "Dear Miss Brooks, your work has been selected by the Ruth Jordan Foundation for support. No regret to inform, just yes." She held the letter for minutes, afraid it might vanish. Then she grabbed her thick research journal, opened a blank page, and wrote the date, not in a notebook, but in her study log, as if it were a discovery. Because it was. It was the first time someone outside Atlanta, outside school, outside that church recognized her work, not for effort or behavior or pity, but for what she'd created. It wasn't Harvard. It wasn't a degree, but it was a beginning, real, documented, undeniable. For Eliza, it proved late nights, self-teaching, makeshift bookshelves, tattered notebooks, all of it mattered. Someone read her words without seeing her face or knowing her zip code and said yes. By spring 2001, her room in South Atlanta looked almost like the library archive where she now worked evenings. Cardboard boxes on the floor, book stacks, printed articles. On the door hung quotes, not cheesy truisms, but excerpts from Reconstruction-era educators. She still woke at 5:30, helped her mom, went to the archive, then taught kids in the church basement. And she did it all without guarantee. Nearly a year had passed since the last college rejection. She held neither bitterness nor blame. School reputations, volunteer listings, and local recommendations weren't enough to open those doors. But she kept going, not out of hope, but necessity. One evening, her mom ran late at work. Eliza sat on the floor sorting old Southern Historical Review issues. One brittle copy caught her attention. An article, well-meaning but messy, on black teachers during the Great Depression. Its footnotes were sloppy, but the topic resonated. Something clicked. She sat at her grandfather's typewriter and started her own version. Tighter, data-rich, carefully cited with a year's worth of material. 3 nights later, she typed her final draft, slipped it into a yellow envelope, and mailed it to the journal's address. 6 weeks passed. Then among mail and bills, she found a slim envelope with a pale blue logo. Sitting at the kitchen table, she opened it slowly. "Miss Brooks, your piece represents an exceptionally rare example of independent scholarship. Sincerely, Professor A. Stallman, Department of Education History, Harvard University." They asked for the full paper and, if she didn't mind, a short bio. Eliza read that letter 3 times. It was handwritten. Cambridge was another world. On the morning she left, she woke at 4 a.m. Her coat was a remodel her mother had stitched from an old surplus one. Her braids were tight, no makeup, not for any statement, just because it felt foreign that day. The train station was half empty. She pulled her carefully folded ticket from the notebook where she jotted notes. It was her first time out of Georgia. When she stepped off the bus in Cambridge, the difference hit her immediately. The air was colder, the buildings taller, and the faces of passers-by more distant. Guided by an old flip phone GPS, she made her way to a building marked Graduate School of Education. Light gray walls, tall windows, floors polished to a shine. Everything felt cleaner, quieter, more formal than anything she'd known before. At the front desk sat a woman in her 50s with a neat haircut and a deliberately blank expression. She glanced at Eliza's coat, her shoes, the folder in her hands, and said nothing, just nodded toward a chair. Eliza sat down. A few minutes later, a man emerged from the hallway. Thin glasses, a polite smile that wasn't quite warm or cold, just academically precise. "Miss Brooks, thank you for coming." He led her down a corridor lined with portraits. Professors, deans, donors. Not a single face that looked like hers. Professor Stallman's office was crammed. Books, papers, photos from conferences. He gestured for her to sit and dove into questions. about her methodology, sources, motivation. She answered clearly, calmly, without trying to impress, just speaking from what she knew. He nodded from time to time. Said her style reminded him of scholars from the 60s, that her work had a kind of urgency you didn't find in students from elite schools. We'd like to offer you a junior research position, 6 months, funded through one of our grants. Your project could fit into that framework. She nodded, not from excitement, but focus. Her room at the visiting scholars' dorm was small, white walls, a narrow bed, a desk. The view from the window, rooftops of old buildings and a Harvard flag. From her suitcase, she took out only what mattered: a notebook, a couple of books, a stack of printouts. The first few weeks were brutal. At the seminars on where she was invited as an observer, the room filled with grads from private schools, name tags on their blazers. They used terms she'd never heard before, referenced books her library had never carried. Some ignored her, not maliciously, just habitually. Others asked questions with a tone that sounded polite but felt like a test. So what program are you in? Which track brought you here? And when she said she wasn't a student, but a visiting researcher, some just nodded and turned to someone else. Not all, but enough. One day, someone left a note in the shared kitchen. Your card doesn't work here. This is for students. Check the rules. No name. Still, she kept going. Every day after the seminar, she returned to her room, opened her notebook, retyped her notes. On weekends, she rode the train to the city library, hunted down books through interlibrary loan. Her research deepened. She added a section on informal schools in post-war Memphis, expanded her source list, included 2 oral histories she'd recorded back in Atlanta. A month in, Stallman asked for a draft. A week later, he handed it back, underlined, annotated, with a few suggestions. And one line at the bottom: this isn't just a paper, this is a contribution. Eliza read it, then carefully closed the folder. She knew this wasn't a win, but for the first time since arriving, she felt like she wasn't invisible. Not entirely, not anymore. Harvard wasn't a place of joy for her. It was a proving ground, a space where nothing came by default, only through effort. But effort, she understood. So when a student stopped her in the hallway, smiling politely and asking for a copy of her paper, professor mentioned it was worth reading, she handed him a printout and said, "It's not the final version, but if you're interested, go ahead." He thanked her. She went back to her room, sat down at the desk, and started the next chapter. The first snow in Cambridge came wet and heavy, crunching beneath boots she'd bought at a thrift store near the Atlanta subway. She crossed campus with her backpack slung over one shoulder, coat reworked from her mother's, lining replaced with flannel, buttons held on with thread salvaged from a nurse's uniform. She was still learning to read this place: granite buildings named after families she'd only seen on street signs, pristine lawns free of chip bags, students walking confidently in expensive jackets, earbuds in, faces bearing that expressionless ease. Not hope, not fear, just the comfort of belonging to a world promised to them since birth. The seminar building used to be a library. Beyond a heavy oak door, a staircase led to the second floor. Eliza climbed it with her shoulders drawn in, like the walls might sniff out her uncertainty. She was 15 minutes early, as always, still afraid someone might come out and say there'd been a mistake, that they'd meant to invite someone else. The meeting room was tucked at the back of the floor, light filtered through tall stained glass windows, not quite religious but nodding to English college style. Inside, a long oval table, polished like a mirror. Heavy chairs with tapestry upholstery, 19th century engravings on the walls, scenes from missionary schools, teachers in long coats, students in uniform. No faces like hers, not in the art, not at the table. By the time the others arrived, men in tweed blazers, women with perfect hair and the newest laptops, Eliza had already taken a seat at the edge. the least comfortable chair, far from the chandelier, a habit, take up less space. Some nodded to her without catching her name. Some didn't nod at all. The first seminar went on as if she weren't there. They discussed a monograph on school policy in the North, written by a Princeton grad. The conversation moved fast, full of names and references she hadn't read. Not because she didn't want to, but because her branch library never carried them. The volunteer warehouse in Atlanta had a copy of Southern Harvard Sociology, 1954, but not the latest on education reform. She stayed silent, not from fear, from caution. She knew if she spoke, it had to be precise, grounded, worth hearing. One misstep, and she'd be dismissed. There wouldn't be a second chance. Professor Stallman sat at the center of the table, rocking slightly in his chair, adjusting his glasses. His eyes drifted to her now and then. Not protectively, just observantly. He knew why she was there, but he wasn't going to step in. This wasn't that kind of place. Survival worked differently here. 3 weeks passed. She read through the nights, bought used books online, requested volumes no one else bothered to borrow. She scribbled notes in a cheap notebook, sketched arguments, crossed out whole pages when her logic fell apart. She realized that knowledge wasn't just language. It was code, and she had to hack her way through it, one piece at a time. Over time, people started to notice her. Quietly, no fanfare, no big acknowledgments. Just a shift. One day during a discussion on racial disparities in standardized testing, she raised her hand, cautiously, deliberately, and said, "The author overlooks systemic bias in the source selection itself. For instance, fieldwork in Fulton County schools is entirely absent from the analysis." The room went still. "You mean Atlanta?" one of the grad students asked. "Yes, southern districts where over 70% of the student population is African American. The resource allocation follows a different logic there." After that, she started getting invited to smaller, closed-door discussions. The silent dismissal turned into a kind of quiet attention. No smiles, no backpats, but her words began to land. In internal memos circulated among the research group, her ideas started to get quoted. Not with credit, not always, but not erased either. The most important turning point was a private conference, invite only, limited to members of the research initiative. Her name was added to the participant list the day before the deadline. Stallman didn't explain. He just forwarded her the invite. The phrasing was clinical. Invited to present preliminary findings. She spent 3 nights preparing, built her slides by hand, not out of some artistic statement, but because her laptop froze every time she tried to animate a chart. The title of her talk, Mechanisms of Illiteracy as a Tool of Educational Segregation, the U.S. South, 1880 to 1930. No one in that room had touched that subject before. She stepped up to the podium wearing a coat with the faint outline of a removed Goodwill tag still visible. Heads turned. No one said a word. She spoke with calm clarity. No frills, no dramatics. Just numbers, dates, context, facts. The room stayed quiet. No applause. But every question that followed was serious. None of them patronizing. And when she finished, a white-haired professor, the same one who'd interrupted every speaker before her, simply nodded and said, "Methodical, very methodical." That was the moment. No ceremony, no endorsement, just a real, unspoken recognition. That evening, back in her narrow dorm room on the edge of campus, she slid a new folder under the bed, right next to the box of rejection letters she kept from her early days. This one held printed feedback, scribbled notes, citations where her name appeared right alongside everyone else's. Not above, but no longer below. She still didn't belong. Not fully. Faculty rarely sat with her in the dining hall. At the used bookstore near Harvard Square, clerks reflexively recommended African American studies texts, even when she asked for archival methodology. Library staff asked to see her ID more often than they asked anyone else. But in that room behind the polished oak table, she was no longer invisible. It wasn't a victory, it was a step. But in a place where there had never been anyone like her, there was now a voice that others couldn't ignore. No fireworks, no standing ovations, just clarity and grit. And Eliza knew the path wasn't closed anymore, not just for her. By the early 2000s, Eliza Brooks had achieved what once felt impossible, even in her wildest daydreams. At 30, she held a full professorship at Harvard, not assistant, not research affiliate, a tenured position in the history department. Her office was modest, a couple of bookshelves, a well-worn desk, and 2 chairs for students. No portraits, no framed diplomas, no trophies, just a pile of drafts, a stack of lecture notes, and a freshly printed copy of her first textbook, thick, soft cover, titled The Invisible Foundation, Marginalized Voices in the History of American Education. She'd been teaching a course based on that book for a few months. Students came to her with caution and returned with purpose. For many, it was the first time they'd heard of the people her curriculum included, people long scrubbed out of syllabi. Eliza didn't try to dazzle or inspire. Her lectures were precise, structured, low on theatrics. But every fact, every source, every story she wove into the fabric of her class was there for one reason: the truth. That morning was ordinary, overcast, a soft fog curling along the narrow streets of Cambridge. Outside her window, bikes whispered past and undergrads rushed toward their seminars. She had arrived early as usual and spent 2 hours editing the manuscript for Volume 2. Her coffee, a vending machine special, had gone cold. Her fingers, calloused from constant typing, moved over the keys with mechanical grace. Her focus was calm, steady, no pride, no euphoria, just the work. By noon, she walked down to the reading room. Plain space, long tables, green desk lamps, the faint scent of paper and dust. She knew it well. She'd spent countless hours here, back when she had no database access, just old archives and a borrowed library card. Now things were different. Her course was part of the core curriculum, not because of pressure, but because the department recognized the rigor, the originality, the sourcing. The room was full. Students huddled over notebooks, scanned chapters, flipped through reference guides. But near the window sat a girl, 16, maybe a bit older. Dark skin, thick curls tied back tight, a jacket clearly not from any recent season. In front of her, a fat notebook filled with sharp, careful handwriting. Eliza noticed the way the girl kept glancing her way, then burying herself back in the pages. Not with fear, with a kind of quiet reverence. She walked over. The girl looked up. No words, just a nod. She didn't ask, "Are you Professor Brooks?" She didn't gush, "I read your book." None of that. Just a look. Watchful, intent, but full of something else too. Hope. And Eliza saw herself, standing alone in the Atlanta archives, typing essays on a borrowed typewriter, collecting rejection letters like coins. Later that same day at a faculty meeting, the topic turned to new appointments. Professor Phillips, a 60-year-old with the posture of a former lawyer and a face permanently creased in suspicion, cleared his throat and said, "We've been getting a lot of mail about Brooks. Some praise her. Some say her approach is alternative." That word, alternative, came up a lot when they talked about her. Not as a dismissal anymore, more like a buffer against admitting the truth outright. They still didn't quite know what to do with someone who didn't fit the mold. Her name didn't carry pedigree. Her voice didn't match the old academic tone, but by now she had become too essential to ignore. Among the faculty, there were 2 people who openly supported her: Dr. Juliana May, a scholar of gender policy, and Professor Stallman, the same man who once sent her the first invitation. His role had grown strategic over the years. He rarely taught, but his voice still carried weight. He never shielded her publicly, but whenever equity and teaching came up, he'd glance in Eliza's direction and say calmly, "We're not here to be liked. We're here to be accurate." After the meeting, she returned to her office. Outside, a gray sky hung low over a stream of students rushing to their next seminar. On the windowsill sat an old faded envelope, the one that had once held her first yes. She kept it not for nostalgia, but as a reminder. Everything that followed had started with a single break in the long chain of rejections. A new stack of letters waited on her desk. Some were from students, others from high schoolers in distant states. They asked if they could intern with her, begged her to read their essays, looked for guidance. One envelope was from Georgia. As Eliza picked it up, a quiet heaviness settled in her chest. Not pain exactly, but something like weary recognition. She opened it. A girl had written, "We don't have a library at our school. I read about you in the paper. Could you tell me where to start?" Eliza didn't set the letter aside. She opened a drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began writing. Start with the questions that won't leave you alone. Don't worry if no one around you has the answers. You'll find them, or you'll come up with better questions. She folded the note together with a few printed pages, her own unpublished drafts but clear enough to follow, and signed the letter by hand. Today, she could be the one sending invitations. She stood at the window, the same window where she once stood, invisible, watching students walk past without ever noticing her. Now she stood differently, still in the same building, but not alone. No longer an exception, the beginning of a new standard. Behind her were years of struggle, rejection letters, long nights, and moments of isolation so sharp they seemed to echo. Ahead of her lay long semesters, difficult debates, the slow, stubborn work of change. But now at Harvard's Department of the History of Education, there was a voice that had never been heard before, and it was being listened to. Eliza stood quietly, eyes on the sky, where the weak sun flickered just behind the clouds. In her reflection, she saw the dreams of the girl she once was, the girl no one expected to make it. She remembered the nights in that tiny room, surrounded by books and rejection slips, when each step forward felt impossible. When society made sure to show her where she didn't belong, and she kept walking anyway, through the tears, through the doubt. But that was then. Now she was here, and her voice, the one they'd tried to silence, the one they'd once ignored, was being heard. Right there, among stacks of papers and the rhythm of ordinary tasks, she understood something. Those who face the hardest obstacles often become the ones who shape the world. Eliza Brooks, who'd been told no more times than she could count, hadn't just cracked the glass ceiling, she'd shattered it. She'd proved that no wall was too high if you had belief and a hunger to know more. She had become the example she once needed to see. And now, as she leaned back at her desk, a young student walked in, eyes full of questions and hesitation, the same look Eliza once had. She smiled just a little and said the words she'd always wanted to hear back when she needed them most. "You can do anything you want. Just don't stop." Her words weren't just encouragement. They were a message to everyone out there fighting for a dream, running into the same wall she had once faced. For every one of us, no barrier is unbreakable. No dream is too far, and every single step forward matters. If this story touched something in you, if it gave you the strength to keep going, know this: stories like Eliza's aren't just fiction. They're real, and they're happening all around us. On our channel, you'll find more of them. True, powerful stories that can change how you see the world and what you believe is possible. Subscribe, because we all deserve to hear these voices, to be inspired, to keep going, even when the world says no. So next time you hear that no, you can say, "I'm just getting started."